Let every soul, let every one, but more importantly, remember now you are a spiritual being. So don't think just with your mind on this problem, but let the inner person. This isn't something that the body necessarily understands. This is something for the soul. And so he goes a little deeper than just saying let every person, but rather let every one or every soul be subject to the higher authority or the governing authority. For there is no authority except from God. And those that are, or rather those that exist, are instituted by God. Now remember the time in which Paul is living. Paul is living not in America, not with the freedoms that you and I enjoy and take for granted. He is living in the times of the Roman Empire. He is living at a time when there is a man, an emperor, sitting on a throne in Rome and delegating his will to the rest of the world. It's a time when the church is facing some scrutiny. It's a time even when the church is beginning to face some persecution. And with all that being said, Paul still says to you and to me, let every soul be subject to the higher authority, for there is no authority but of God. The authorities that exist are ordained by God. God said, let there be a Persian Empire. Let there be a Greek Empire. Let there be a Roman Empire. Now, I think the reason Paul has to stop here, if you would, in the midst of all this spiritual understanding, is to deal with a problem that may have been beginning to poke its head up in the early church. Now, remember, the church was founded, first of all, on Judaism. The first converts for many, many years to the church were Jews. Jews only told other Jews about Jesus Christ. It wasn't until the Lord sent Peter to Cornelius that they began to understand, oh, we're supposed to tell other people. Even then they were keeping it to the Gentiles that found themselves in Judea. And then something miraculous happens. Revival breaks out in Antioch, Syria. And there are Gentiles who are Gentiles. And all of a sudden, they find themselves with the same experiences and the same gospel that the Jews had. And so they send up a bunch of folks to investigate this, and they find out it's the same God, the same Spirit, the same message, doing things the same way up here with Gentiles that he was doing down here with us. Now, you see, here's the problem, though. The Jews, many of them hold on to the book of Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy, I think it's 17:15 or 15:17, but I think it's 17:15. There is a law about the king. And a Jew could only have a king who was another Jew. That was before they even came into their own land. God said, someday you're going to want a king, and here's the rule for a king. You can only have a king who is your brother. You cannot have a king that is not your brother. So all of a sudden then those in the church, the Jews in the church, come on in and they begin to say, what are you doing serving Rome? You can't serve somebody who is not a Jew. And the emperor certainly is not Jewish. Therefore, and that's why in Palestine they were always fighting with the Romans. They were always fighting. And they were always rebelling because they held tenaciously to that thought. And I think that thought may have begun to creep into others in the church. So Paul says, wait, let's hold on here for just a second. Let's think this thing through. And so he begins very abruptly with Romans chapter 13, verse 1. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist are instituted by God. Paul wants the church to understand we have a duty to the government. And so he wants us to understand, really, we have three duties he's going to share out with you and me. Duty number one, if my clicker will work. This part works. How come this part doesn't? All right. Duty number one, and I'll use this with me then. Duties we owe to government. What is it that you and I... Now, we have a responsibility. We reap the benefits of this great land. And so there is something, if we equally share, then we have an equal responsibility to carry that out. So we owe something to government, Paul wants us to know. And the first thing you owe is that of submission. Submit yourselves. Let every soul be subject, Paul says. Peter says to you and to me in his letter, that we should submit ourselves to every ordinance of man. Titus, again, this idea is carried out again and again by Paul and also by Peter. Now, here's the problem in our mind. Let every soul, or let every person be subject to every ordinance. Now, here's our conflict that we have. We look back in the Old Testament very quickly, and we remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when the king came to them and said, "Bow down and worship me." And they wisely said, "We are to obey God rather than man." Good words, which is true. The ordinance of man compared to the laws of God are a very small thing. But the problem in Paul's day was that people were drawing a very broad line and listing and imagining everything that we have that tendency, don't we? We look for a small sliver of hope to which we could pry wide open some crack or some reasoning that others have. And this was true in their time as well. Let every soul be subject to the higher authority. But what about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Well, clearly, if government is against God, then we must be against the government. Clearly understood. Where the government draws a line, for example, if the government, as they were doing in the days of the Old Testament, came up and said, "You must offer your children to Moloch," you and I, by God's word, have a command not to offer our children to false gods. We have a command not to do those wicked things. There's a clear command. But our government is not asking us to do that. It's not asking us to commit human sacrifice, the sacrifice of our children on the altars of pagan deities. That's not what they're doing. So you can't draw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as your excuse for any reason. I have to obey God. And then you come up with some reasoning that is outside the scope that Paul is giving us here. Now, I remind you that Paul was living in the days of the Roman government. Paul was living in a day and time when there was no Constitution of the United States, where there were no Bill of Rights, and where life for Christian people was not easy. And yet he said to them, "Let every soul be subject to the higher authority." I don't think you and I have any excuses. If Paul didn't have one, then we don't have one. We are therefore required to obey. Whenever I say to you that the laws of man are not in direct variance with the laws of God, then we reserve the right to disagree. But in so much that they are not requiring me to stand up and deny Jesus Christ, they're not requiring that I should deny the cross, then I can obey. There may come a time when they say to you and to me that Christianity is illegal. You can't serve Jesus Christ. I will then have to openly disobey. Because at that point, God reigns supreme. But short of that, while I am here and enjoying the protections of this government, then I have a responsibility to submit. Submit to those who are in authority. I might not agree with all of them. Sometimes I like their authorities and sometimes I don't. There are folks in city government that I may or may not agree with. There are folks in county government I may or may not agree with. There are folks in state government that I clearly don't agree with. And there are many on the national stage that I disagree with as well. But I have the responsibility to be submissive. What is my submission then? Submission to you and to me comes in a clear form for us. Support. How do I support my government? Well, they made that very clear for me to understand. Paul follows through. Therefore, give to all their dues. To the one who is due tax, pay your taxes. Tribute to whom tribute. There are taxes levied against my house. I own a house, therefore I pay property tax. I go to the grocery store and I buy groceries and I pay a tax at that point. There are my car, I buy a car, I pay tax. I go to the gas station, I pay tax on. I mean, I am paying tax after tax after tax. Why? That's part of my support. I don't get to stand up and say, I refuse to pay my taxes. Go ahead. Stand up and say that one. It won't last very long, I'll guarantee it. We have this duty. And part of our duty, listen, I enjoy the freedom of this nation. There was a slogan that was very popular in my youth, and that was that freedom isn't free. My dad used to tell us that even as kids. There's a cost to living in a free country. My dad instilled in us that each one of his boys ought to serve in the military. It was just the way he understood it. So my brother John went into the Army, my brother Charlie into the Marine Corps, I went into the Navy. Because somebody's got to pay the price for us to be free. And so that was part of, along with my taxes, came my support. And my support came in the form of enlisting, even though when I was enlisted, it was a volunteer. There was no more drafting anymore. They got rid of the draft just a couple of years before I enlisted. But still, my dad said, freedom isn't free. Somebody has to pay the price. And so those of us who chose to support our government, not only by paying our taxes, but by wearing her uniform, we're still supporting our government and supporting, because here in America, we're kind of unique in that our government, you ever notice when they wrote down our Constitution, most of the laws in the Constitution are against the government? Most of the rules and regulations written by our forefathers aren't against you and me. They're against government. They're telling the government what they cannot do. Now, granted, in the 240 years or so, government has gotten in there and begun to rewrite. And you'll notice now they're passing more legislation against you, where we used to pass legislation against them. You cannot have an unlawful search and seizure. You cannot have taxes without representation. You cannot. Government is listed or limited to this. Government is limited by this. And we constantly were writing rules and regulations to limit government. That was the thought of the Founding Fathers. But we've gotten lazy over the years. And nobody wants to do the hard work. So we've allowed government now to begin to write the rules and regulations instead of the people. And the government comes by now and says, wait, you the people can't say this to us. You the people, see, we're allowing, why? Because we're not supporting anymore. We used to support not only with our taxes, but with our vote. It was part of my responsibility to know what was going on in my country and to put people in charge who would follow the edict of our founding fathers, who would support the Constitution and make sure she was enforced. But we all got a little bit lazy. And we don't support the way we ought to, because support's a lot of work. For me, it was enlisting in the Navy. For me, it's been paying my taxes. For me, it's been teaching and preaching throughout this country. That's been part of my support for this nation. To educate people, to tell people what we should do and why we should do it. Why am I supporting? I'm paying taxes to whom taxes, and tributes to whom tributes, and custom to whom custom. That's part of my responsibility, and that's what we as Christians have to do. I don't get to say, hey, let somebody else pay my tax for me. I'm not looking for somebody richer than I to pay my part. It's like the church. Every one of us in the church comes together. You give your 10%, I give my 10%. Nathaniel gives his 10%, Mikey gives his 10%. We each give our 10% because that's how God laid down the government of the church. How do you support? It's not fair that we should say to Joyce, Joyce, you got to support 100% of the whole church. No, she's got her 10. Now her 10% may be different from mine. Hers is probably much larger than mine. Oh, sure. Yeah. But my 10% is still my 10%. And her 10% of whatever she makes is 10% of whatever she makes. Richard's 10% of whatever he makes is his 10%. Ella is given 10% of... Now, her monies may be different from my monies. And her monies may be different from your monies. But it's her 10%. So we're all sharing equally 10% of the responsibility of God's house. We're not sitting there saying, well, you know what? We'll let the preacher pay for everything. Or his lovely wife. She'll pay for everything. We don't know. We share it together. And the same is true in our nation. I don't let somebody else pay my part. The government comes by to me and says, Terry, I want you to pay 26% of everything you make so that we can function as a government. And then they say, oh, and besides that, we're going to take a little bit more. Ends up being about 52% of my income goes to the form of taxes. But see, look where I live and the cost of all of this. It isn't, now, do I agree with everything they do with my money? No. But once I give my taxes, I am done. Until the election cycle comes around, then I can say, wait, I didn't like the way you did it. You're out of here, and I'm going to put somebody else in there. Then, see, I'm still supporting because I'm thinking all the time. I'm working all the time. I'm paying all the time. I'm listening all the time. I'm voting all the time. Those are things that I'm doing to support my government. But I have another responsibility. Boy, I wish this button worked. Okay. And here it is. Respect. Fear to whom fear is due, and honor to whom honor is due. Now that one is sadly lacking. Now, as I said already, I don't agree with everything they say 100% of the time, and I am allowed to disagree politically with people. It is okay if I say about the president, I don't agree with what he said here. But I'm not allowed to disrespect him. I'm not allowed to call him names or gossip about him. Whether I agree with whoever happens to be president or I disagree. That's not the place of this church to sit here and gossip about whoever is in the White House. That's not what we do. We're not here to gossip about our senators or our representatives, whether they be state or federal. We're not here to gossip about the mayor. That's not our job. Now, can I say I disagree with the mayor? Sure, I can. I disagree with some political thing he did, and I have the right to do that. But I don't have the right to slander. I don't have a right to be disrespectful in my address to them, which is, I got to tell you, going crazy right now. See, we don't think like the world. So I don't get to be disrespectful. Fear to whom fear is due, and honor to whom honor. And we honor them not because of some special privileged person that they may or may not be, but by the title that they hold. Remember what we were told? That we were to submit ourselves to the higher power. Why? Because they were ordained by God. So to be disrespectful to government is to be disrespectful to God. Because for whatever reason, he thought that it was important that now I haven't agreed with, and I got to say this, I haven't agreed with all of God's choices. But I'm not going to tell him that. I'm going to keep it my secret. I wonder sometimes why, I don't know, and it's not up for me to know. I know this much, that God is working all things out so that when the end comes, it comes exactly the way he said it would when he said it would happen. I don't have to agree with every move he makes. I just have to understand that God knows something that I don't know. And that God is working out something that I may never understand. I probably won't understand it till I get to heaven and know all things, and then I'll say, wow, God's awfully smart. I should have agreed with him back then. He was right to put that particular person in that particular position. Sometimes we look at them and say, but they accomplished nothing. You don't know what little thing God needed them to do to have a larger result down the road. So to that end, then, I'm not allowed to be disrespectful. I don't get to pick on. I don't get to talk bad about. I don't get to say that they're idiots and dummies and all the rest of the things that I might like to say. We don't get to do that. Particularly, we don't get to do it publicly and out loud. This is not a platform for browbeating anybody. This is simply an opportunity for us to follow God and to understand that God said, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Remember, James warns us that there are those who are not afraid to speak evil of dignities and thereby bringing themselves to damnation. God puts a pretty high premium on the way you and I act. He looks pretty closely at our respect. Not that you agree with them. That's not important. But that you respect them. I don't agree with the policeman when he pulls me over because I know I did nothing wrong. Now, mind you, I'm going hypothetical here. I may or may not ever been pulled over by a policeman. But if I were, let's just suppose for the sake of argument now, that maybe once, all right, 3 times, I may have been in a dream state of some sort, I was pulled over by a policeman. I don't get to rant and rave against him. I don't get to call him names. I simply hand him my driver's license, and I said, can I help you, officer? He said, yes, you could sign this ticket right here. Hey, he's not where I place my argument. I don't get to get mad at him. Now, he may have been wrong. I may have tried to justify myself there on the side of the road, but guess what? Did it work? No. When I was a young man just beginning to drive, I was only 16 years old. My cousin from Poway called and her child was sick, so I ran down to Poway to take her and her son to the hospital. It was raining outside, and as I'm driving down the highway, this policeman pulls me over for running a stop sign. So I said, I didn't see a stop sign. He said, doesn't matter, there was a stop sign right there and you ran it. I get out of my car and I said, where? He shines his flashlight back there and he said, well, there should be one there someplace. Okay. He still wrote me the ticket. It wasn't my place to be disrespectful to him. It wasn't my place to wrestle him to the ground and try to pull a gun away from him. It wasn't my place to do anything but show respect. Honor to whom honor and fear to whom fear. That was my responsibility at that point in time. When I got before the judge, explained my case, that's the place for me to make my argument. Not with that policeman who's got a lot of things to do, who's a very busy man and worried for his life all the while he is out there on the beat. That's not my place to give him another headache. It's my place to give that to the judge. Because that's what he does. He listens to arguments. Cops don't listen to arguments, they write tickets. Judges, they don't write tickets, they listen to arguments. And so make sure you carry it to the right place. So fear to whom fear, respect to whom respect. Do not speak evil of dignities, lest you bring damnation upon yourself. That's the biblical rule. Now, there are grounds, there's reasons for what Paul is arguing here under our behavior pattern. We have grounds on which this obligation rests. There's a reason why. And Paul is going to lay this foundation down for you and for me. And he says the first one, and we mentioned it earlier, is this penalty. If you practice evil, be afraid. For he or it or the government does not bear the sword in vain. That policeman has a gun on his side for a purpose and a reason. His purpose is to uphold the laws that you and I, for the most part, voted on. The laws that you and I said, you know what? I am sick and tired of people robbing me. I want an ordinance that says you can't steal from me anymore. I am sick and tired of people murdering each other. I want a law that says you shall not commit murder. And now we need somebody to make sure that those are enforced. And so we asked this guy here, would you wear this badge and make sure that I abide and they abide by all the same rules? And then the Bible says to make sure, listen, a law is no good if you don't enforce it. For years, America had laws and we don't enforce it. Our government today said, you know what? We don't have to write any new rules. There's no new laws to write. There's just the enforcement of the old laws. There's more than enough laws out there. Let me tell you already, Congress does not need to be writing more. They only need to make sure that the laws that are out there are being enforced. So he doesn't bear the sword. That policeman doesn't have that gun for no purpose. His job is to make sure that murderers don't murder, and robbers don't rob, and thieves don't steal. That's his job. And so to protect you and me and to protect himself, they are armed. Government, because it has a responsibility to protect. Listen, we live in the freest country on earth, but there's a lot of people who would like to come here and disrupt our freedom. We have seen that. And so we maintain a powerful military. We have the strongest Navy in the world because nobody messes with the Navy. You saw the commercial. To get to you, they got to get past us. And ain't no one getting past us. We just put the Ford into action. Newest of all the ships in the fleet. Powerful. Most powerful ship ever sent to sea. It's going to make a lot of people stop and think. Why? Because it doesn't... See, we don't have a military for no purpose and no reason. You don't keep a military around so that they sit around and do nothing. You have to use them for something. So they bear the sword. We have a military so that we can exercise that, and when people attack us, they find that we're willing to attack right back. And we're willing to stop them in their tracks. And then it stops them from thinking twice about attacking because nobody wants to pay the price, particularly if the price is high. You have to enforce the laws. See, there is a penalty to not abiding by the rules. There's a penalty for not submitting. There's a penalty for not paying your taxes. There is a penalty for not being respectful. There are rules and regulations, and this penalty phase is there. They are a terror to evil works, the book reminds us. They don't bear it in vain, but we're also reminded this: they are the ministers of God to revenge. Wow. Government has a huge responsibility and a huge role to play in our safety. And so Paul wants to remind you and I about that. Verse 3, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Then do what is good, and you'll have their approval. For government is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, because it does not carry the sword for no reason. For government is God's servant, an avenger that brings wrath on him that does wrong. The full weight of the U.S. government falls on the head of people who want to do wrong. That's their job. We got whole systems set up for that purpose. See, that's the penalty side. Okay, granted, it's not the most high and noble, but that keeps a lot of, 90% of us do what the government says just because of the government. The other 10% of us need that penalty phase. If you do this, then this is going to happen to you. My mother used to have the old if-then. And boy, let me tell you, that was a powerful weapon in Mom's arsenal. If you don't want to know what will happen to you. I didn't want to know what would happen to me. So guess what? I did. See, sometimes Mom would bring that penalty phase right out there in the open. And boy, let me tell you, the penalty phase, when you're looking at it, you don't want any of that. Mom was a great big giant 5'2" woman. Boy, let me tell you, she could bring the wrath of God down on you quick. Before you even knew what was hitting you, you was being hit. And Mom, boy, let me tell you, she was the old spare the rod and spoil the child. She had no spoiled children. She did not spare that rod. I mean, Mom come after you quick and fast. And she would give you that warning. Do what I said. Remember the old or else? Mom always kept that secret weapon of or else. That or else was right there. And if you didn't obey, the or else was not far away. Some of us need that penalty. Some of us need the or else. Some of us, you don't want to know what's going to happen to you. We want that kept there. Why? Because it helps keep that other 10% of people in check, who aren't as high and noble and obey just because it's the right thing to do. Some of us won't do the right thing unless we're made to do it. And so government has to have that opportunity, that penalty phase. But there's not only the penalty, we have to stop and consider this. There is not only a penalty, but there is an advantage. For the rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the bad. And do you desire to be not afraid of authority? Do the good, and you shall have praise from it. For it is the servant of God for your good. That's the advantage of it. The advantage is I live in the freest nation on earth. I have rules and regulations that are protecting me from government's overreaching arm. I live in a country that has a strong military presence in the world, so that the rest of the world is thinking twice about what they're going to do to me and to you. We gather ourselves here in this church to talk about God, not being afraid that stormtroopers are going to push in our door and come and arrest us for what we're doing or saying. We have all these freedoms. See, that's the advantage that we live under. That's the advantage we have because we do pay our taxes. We do show respect. Listen, worse than not, even worse than a bad government is no government. No government is always worse. Go to the Middle East right now where they have no government set up. Go to parts of the world where the bad guys outnumber even the governments there. And let me tell you, go to Sudan, where government has fallen apart. Go to Libya, where government has fallen apart. Go to Syria, where government has fallen apart. Go to Iraq, where government for so long had fallen apart. Go to Afghanistan, where government had fallen apart. I'll guarantee you spend 24 hours there, you will be begging and pleading to come back. And you probably won't even complain about paying your taxes ever again. Because you'll say, wow, I might not agree with everything my government does, but I'll tell you this much, they're making sure that I have the freedoms that I enjoy. I got to go on vacation. I traveled from this state to the next state, and guess what? No harassment. My government was watching over, protecting, keeping me safe even while I was on vacation. Policemen driving the highway to make sure that there was no drunk driver chasing me down. Everywhere I went, there was some law enforcement making sure that everybody was abiding by some rule, some law, so that all of us got to enjoy it. That's the advantage that we have. And God wants you and I to understand. We sit unafraid, for the most part, of our government. We have that advantage. And finally, there comes this consideration. And I consider this with you. It is not necessary in order to make any power the ordinance of God that it should be nominated by God himself. Now, granted, God said, "This is my servant Moses, and you will listen to him. This is my servant David. You will obey him." There are those that God has chosen. Aaron will be my high priest. You'll obey him. There are those that God specifically by name called out and said, "This is my man." But it's not necessary that God name every ruler and that he announce every president, every king, every emperor. He doesn't have to. God said, listen, all government is mine. I raise them up and I take them down. Therefore, whoever I have chosen to raise up, you will obey. It's not just that God has ordained the individual person, but he's ordained a process. Marriage is ordained of God between a man and his wife. That's the ordinance that God... Yes, it's contractual. My wife and I sat there and we agreed to certain rules and regulations. And her dad happened to be the preacher officiating in our wedding. And he said to me, Terry, do you promise to do this, this, and this? And I said, I do. And then he looked at his daughter, my wife, and said, do you promise to treat him like this, and this, and this? And she said, I do. We signed a covenant or a contract, but more importantly, God ordained what marriage should be. And in the confines of it, I find that I have responsibilities and she has responsibilities. We don't rewrite the contract. God laid it out for us in His Word. And so, according to His Word, we live under that contract. It is a contract not just between her and I, but a contract between her and God and me and God and her, and God is the arbitrator. When she disagrees with me, she goes to God and says, God, I disagree with him. And God says, wait, remember this? Oh yeah, the part about honor and obey. Do I really have to? Hey, you signed the contract. And then I go to God and I say, hey, you know that child you gave me? And he says, wait, hold on. Remember this? Where you promised to love her and cherish her? You ain't cherishing right about now. All right, go back and do your job. And so we have this, but it's more than just her and me. It's God involved. And so it's more than just me and the president, me and the Congress, me and the assembly. It's me and God and the president, me and God and the Senate, me and God and the assembly, me and God and the county, and me and God and the city, and me and God's involved in all of these things. Because God said, hey, I put that man there for a particular purpose or reason. Now, in the next election, I might guide things a little differently. Your job is to vote. My job is to ensure the outcome of the election. And God overrides all of us when He does that. We might not like the one that God chose, but it's the one that God chose. Do you think that we as Americans could actually outvote God? No. So whether I agree with who was or who is doesn't matter. God agreed, and God had some purpose and reason for appointing them and using them for some short time. And it's their responsibility when they answer to God, and God said, listen, I gave you 8 years. What did you give me? And God says, I gave you 4 years. What did you give me? And they have to sit there and say, well, they can either rattle off their goods for him or say we didn't do anything. But that's between them and their God. I don't get to judge another man's servant. I can say I disagree with this policy and that policy, but I don't get to pick on them and I don't get to look into their heart. That's the consideration that we have here. That God may not call everyone by name, but God set up a system. And I don't get to buck the system. God's in control of all things all the time, yes or no? Does God make any mistakes, yes or no? Then do I have a responsibility then to submit, to support, and to respect? Sure I do. That's what we do because we are Christian people. Because my allegiance isn't to any particular person in any particular office. It's to God overall. My obligation to government, to be subject, to pay my taxes, and render to them their due. I may not agree with everything, but hey, I don't get to call them names. I don't get to burn them in effigy. I might not agree with every policeman that's ever given me a ticket, but I don't get to wish them harm or do them harm. It's my responsibility to support. I don't get to be an anarchist. I'm a Christian. Therefore, I will be subject to the higher authority. I will pay my taxes, and I will give honor to whom honor and fear to whom fear. Let's all stand.